So thank you for being so responsive already, and welcome everybody to University of Western Australia and our panel tonight. My name's Paul McGlade. I'm the director of the UWA Public Policy Institute, and the event this evening is a collaboration and partnership with my colleagues from the UW Law School. And I got to get this right. I always get the organisation wrong. It's the Australian Association of Constitutional Law. It's a bit like the American Dodgeball Association of America, you know, in terms of getting things wrong. So, and this is a kind of repeat of a panel that we held last year, basically in the run-up to the Voice Referendum. And interestingly, we were actually in this room last August in the run-up to the Voice. So it's it's interesting and kind of a nice circle of life to come back here in a way, albeit to kind of reflect on what didn't happen, what most of us probably wanted to happen last year. And we've got a number of panelists from last year who were here last year, here on the panel this year again, so it's going to be really great. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of overview, some housekeeping, and then I'm going to have a welcome to Country, and then I'm going to hand over to our chair for this evening, Sophie Coffin. So I just move out of the way so everybody can see you. So I'm going to introduce Robin Collard, who's going to give us a welcome to Country. So just let and grandson, who's going to play the didgeridoo for us as well. So Robin and grandson. Trice, the floor is all yours.
Hop we're in Nija, calling Jinang. Wanju. Wanju Nija, calling Jinang. Janabidi. Mort Jinang. Ngai. Winyan wa? Mordich. Mort. Janabidi, Jenna. Waranka Jinang. Wankani. Kep ngani. Nija. Dat nyin. Kar. Murdich. Maman ngunis. Yogas jukan. Wanju Nija. Wajak nyunga buja. Hello and welcome to Wajak country. Our ancestors have walked this land for many thousands of years. At times, their footsteps have hit the ground, the dust flying, the stories being told around the campfire, sharing the food and the water, keeping the stories and the culture alive. And there have been tears of happiness, but also tears of sadness. Ngan kurt wara jinang nija wanking. Particularly when the outcome of the Voice happened. My heart was hurting. Because if we remember, not only me in the audience this evening, but there are others, but for me, the first 10 years of my life was being classed as flora and fauna here in the city. So my parents, my grandparents, my brothers and sisters were a part of that. And now, as a part of the referendum last year, my grandchildren and their hearts have been broken too. And so for me, in terms of doing a welcome to country, The one thing that I will not do is wear my bwaka, my traditional kangaroo coat, because I feel that there's something missing. I have only worn it when I have done Aboriginal functions where the audience has been our own people. So that's a little bit of the fallout. But when we welcome to country, it's about showing kindness and respect. Babinga babinga nija yanka. Making friends with the people that we meet. It's the connection of people that make us connect to one another. To hear the stories. We have many stories to share of our footsteps on the land. And for our children and grandchildren. From the past to the present. To build hope for my grandchildren for the future. And so this is our story. And so for me, bringing one of my grandsons along to play the yiriki or the didgeridoo, we are also summoning the good energy to this place because we need to hear about what that impact is. Because one day, they are our storytellers. They are our cultural future. And we need to keep our stories strong, our language strong, and our mort strong, our families, because too often in the past, they have been broken. So we need to hear, to listen deeply, to learn and understand, so that we walk, live and play together on this land in harmony. Ngalakan keng nija, ngalakan bola nija, kura kura jinang wadran, mai nonakan, kuling wajak nyonga buja. We are one and we are many. From all the lands on earth we've come. To be sitting here in this one room this evening, to be listening to the stories, not only of the past, but also for the future. Kaya kor yanka yiriki nija, jenang. Ne, we listen to the whispers of the leaves and the trees. Ngabalangunda nija walbring, for the healing and the truth-telling that we share with you today. Kedlak jenang. Murich. Yanka, thank you.
Thanks, Robin, and thanks, Tyson, for welcoming us to country. I'll just wait while everyone else comes in. Come on in, folks. You're very welcome. It's okay. It'll be fine. So I'll just repeat my welcome to everyone again, and also said in Irish, I've just come back from Ireland, so it'll be Kate Mita Fulcha. So my name is Paul McGinn. I'm the director of the UWA Public Policy Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here to UWA this evening for our panel discussion, The Voice Referendum, Reflections on the Road Ahead. And what we at the Public Policy Institute are basically responsible for doing is socializing, facilitating and promoting big policy issues and discussions through dialogue in an attempt to raise awareness, knowledge, and hopefully provoke action, whether that's in policy or out in the community in different ways. And I think the panel tonight is going to reflect on one of the kind of the most significant policy decisions or indecisions in Australian history, not just in the last year or so, but probably, you know, since Federation, basically. So it's an honour to have you all here and to have this panel here this evening as well. So just a couple of quick housekeeping rules. So in the event of an emergency, there are 2 exit doors, one to my right, or your left as you're looking at me, and then also to the left, to my left, to your right, just behind the wall here as well. So if you hear an alarm, just evacuate the building as quickly as possible. There's a door just here on the left as you go out, and then there's a door, the main door that you come in as well. And if you do need to use the bathrooms, restrooms, you can leave, you can go out through that door and then go round to the facilities there. So the panel, as you can see from the title, is to kind of reflect on the past, but also look to the future, basically, in terms of where are we heading in terms of Indigenous voices and I suppose in Indigenous politics within an Australian context. And I'm lucky enough to have Ken Wyatt as the chair of my board, and I meet Ken on a regular basis, and we're often kind of discussing this in general things, and it's an honor for me to have Ken on the board and you know, to learn from speaking to him and kind of discussing and debating these issues. And the way the panel is going to work this evening is Sophie Coffin is going to chair the event, and I was just chatting to Sophie earlier on in terms of the circle of life, in terms of this event here, being here this year and last year. I have a connection with Sophie through her mum. So back in 2008, I wrote a chapter with Julie Coffin and another colleague, the late Andrew Guilfoyle. And the chapter was called Make Sure There's a Shady Tree. And it was looking at participatory action research with Indigenous populations. And I think this evening kind of speaks to that theme in a way, in terms of gathering and yarning and reflecting both backwards and projecting forwards and things. And I think Sophie's going to do an amazing job in kind of leading the discussion tonight. No pressure. No pressure whatsoever. So I'm going to hand it over to Sophie. Sophie's going to introduce our panel, and then we're going to get stuck into the discussion. And there's going to be an opportunity for questions for you, the audience, and myself and my colleague Claire Feenan from the Public Policy Institute. We're going to be the mic runners, so we're going to be running up and down the aisles, looking at hands. And Sophie gets the privilege of selecting who gets the mic. We just run things. So put your hand up, and you're all in Sophie's capable hands. No pressure, Sophie.
Thanks.
Okay. So without further ado, Sophie, over to you.
Thank you. I do have this mic on. Can you hear me through that? Can you hear me at the back? Cool, thank you. Thumbs up. So thank you for the introduction. I want to acknowledge that we're meeting on Wajak Noongar Budja and pay my respects to elders past and present and my own elders, and acknowledge other Aboriginal people here tonight. And I also thank Annie Robin and her nephew? Her grandson, for the beautiful welcome to country. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you also to our panellists. We're really lucky to have such an esteemed panel of leaders here, and I think this will be a really constructive and interesting discussion, reflecting on what's happened but also looking forward. And I think it's important to remember the context that this was a very difficult time for a lot of us. We had felt very strongly about this referendum because it wasn't just a day where we voted, it was our whole lives and our culture in the balance. So first I'd like to introduce our panellists. I'll start with the Honourable Ken Wyatt AM, who really needs no introduction. So Ken was the first Indigenous person elected to the House of Representatives and appointed to the Commonwealth Ministry, and the first to serve in Cabinet when he was appointed Minister for Indigenous Australians in 2019. In his first term of Parliament, Ken was appointed co-chair of the Joint Select Committee on Constitutional Recognition for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and led the co-design process. Ken also was the Minister for Aged Care, Indigenous Health and Senior Australians, and currently, as was said already, Ken is currently the Chair of the Public Policy Board. So welcome, Ken. Then Associate Professor Dr. Hannah McGlade. Dr. McGlade is a Noongar human rights lawyer and academic who's published widely on many aspects of Aboriginal legal issues, especially those affecting the lives of Aboriginal women and children. Dr. McGlade was admitted as a solicitor and barrister of the Supreme Court of Western Australia in '96 and completed a master's degree in international human rights law before working for national bodies like Assoc and IATSIS. Dr. McGlade is currently an associate professor at the Curtin University School of Law and is an expert member on the UN Permanent Forum of Indigenous Issues. So welcome, Hannah. Next, Aurora Milroy. Aurora is a Bulgu woman and the Director of Policy at the National Native Title Council. She holds a Bachelor of Laws and Bachelor of Arts from UWA and a Master of Public Policy from Oxford. Aurora has worked across the public, tertiary and not-for-profit sectors, including as a lecturer at UWA Law School. Currently, Aurora is a director of Bulgu Juddi Aboriginal Corporation and was previously a director at Oxfam Australia. And last but certainly not least, Tyson McEwan. Tyson is a proud Bardi and Kariyara man from the Pilbara town of Port Hedland. Tyson graduated from UWA with a Juris Doctor and works as a lawyer at a Perth law firm. Tyson was a WA youth representative of the Uluru Statement from the Heart and volunteered many hours to public engagement on educating the community about the voice, and he worked very tirelessly in that space. So welcome to all of our panellists. My first question is for Ken. As someone with so much experience in Aboriginal affairs and politics, do you think there are opportunities for constitutional reform in the future?
In short, no. The question has been put twice, firstly by John Howard and the more recent one by Prime Minister Albanese. When you have two rejections, governments are very reticent to bring back the question a third time. The other thing, I don't think our people will trust another government to bring forward a question for a constitutional change, because the rejection out of the last one has been extremely impactful. And think about some of the people who lived in small country towns, who went to the ballot box, cast their vote, and when they looked at the ballot numbers, they saw that 80 to 90% of the people in those towns did not support a yes vote, even though they had lived there all their lives. And I've seen so much anger amongst people, even our leadership. You very rarely hear from the leadership now in media. We tend to stay out of it. So, and I think the other challenge we've had is governments of all persuasions are not being proactive verbally on policies to do with Aboriginal people in this nation, or First Nations people, Torres Strait and Aboriginal. And I don't hear them talking about election commitments. And we already have elections that are looming for a couple of jurisdictions, ours and Queensland. There's a federal one. And you'll notice too that Minister Malandiri only talks about closing the gap, nothing else. Because I think she is confined to focusing on that issue, not truth-telling or the other elements of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And so I can't see our mob in the first instance agreeing to another question. And I can't see a coalition government leading this and having the trust of Indigenous Australians. And I certainly don't think Labor governments will bring it back for some time if they try and do it. It would have to be the under 40 generation who would bring it back in 20, 30 years' time. That's the time span. And most of my era will be gone. So the short answer was no, with a long explanation.
Thank you. I really appreciate that response. My next question is for Hannah. With your extensive background in international human rights work, what do you think the international human rights perception of the referendum outcome was, and what does it mean for Australia now in that space?
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. I mean, it was a year ago, and it was a very painful time for Aboriginal people and our supporters, and I remember many of us were crying. You know, it was a devastating blow. And I travelled to Sapmi and met the Sami people who have their own Indigenous parliaments to look at those models just after it, actually, a couple of days. And, you know, I met an elder in the service station in Sapmi, and, you know, he told me how he'd been watching this referendum and how sad he was for us. And, of course, the Sami parliamentarians I met as well also expressed a lot of sadness for us. I just want to make it clear there, and also in the Māori people particularly that I met with after, really expressed a lot of remorse for Aboriginal people. But I think this obviously sent a very clear message internationally to governments across the world that we haven't tackled our racist past, unfortunately. Yeah. And, you know, we have a reputation internationally for violence against Aboriginal people, for Aboriginal deaths in custody, for mistreatment and violence of Aboriginal youth, which is ongoing. And so that confirmed it. That confirmed that we've got a problem here that we really haven't tackled. Some people say this wasn't about racism, but I think, you know, there was certainly a racist undertone to it. And it's not an issue that we've done a lot on. We're just now doing our first national action plan on racism, notwithstanding advice of UN treaty bodies for many years. So what does it mean for Australia in this space? Well, as a country and as a nation, we can't speak with great authority really on human rights when we really haven't, you know, tackled the issues in our own backyard. And I know that's what some UN Indigenous experts and people have told the Australian government, who have now appointed an Aboriginal ambassador. Fix things in your own backyard. Address your country and your treatment, your mistreatment of Aboriginal people.
Thank you. My next question is for Aurora. You have an extensive background working in spaces that navigate the relationship between the law and Aboriginal people. What are your observations on the change in perceptions and responses of Indigenous people generally post-referendum?
Thanks, Sophie. Just at a sort of general level, and, you know, Ken and Hannah have already said this, the sort of shock of the referendum result, even though it wasn't really a shock in and of itself, you sort of knew it was coming, it was probably going to be a no, all the sort of rational part of you says it's going to be a no, but that emotional shock to your system of when you actually get delivered that result, with that sort of rejection of Aboriginal people, and I don't really take rejection very well, so it was a really horrible time. And me, Sophie and Tyson were actually in Sydney at the time for the National Indigenous Legal Conference, and so you're with a group of kind of legal people at the sort of pinnacle legal question about Indigenous people, and I remember all of us just sort of feeling really flat about that. I remember walking the streets of Sydney and sort of like giving everyone evils, thinking like, did you vote no? Did you not vote no? But apparently Sydney was one of the few places that voted yes. So yeah, Sophie was like, stop giving them evils. But I think, you know, that sort of sense of defeat was pretty immediate. And one of the really scary things for me was actually, you know, I've grown up with some pretty staunch people. You know, Hannah is particularly one of them who's constantly fought. I've worked for Pat Turner, who's constantly fighting, even my own mum, who's constantly fighting. And I saw, I'm sure you kept fighting straight day two, but, you know, I saw my mum falter a bit, and I saw Pat sort of say, I don't know what to do. And, you know, if we think about the theme of tonight being the road ahead, what's the future? We all as young people looked to, or me as maybe not as young as the others, but we all looked to the people that we'd been learning from that always had the answers, that were always fighting the fight, knew what was next, and they faltered because they were bearing in a deep emotional pain themselves, and didn't really know what to do next, right? So I think for me there was this sort of sense of pause that came after, and this change of perception of why are we working. Luckily, it was very short-lived and everyone went back to fighting pretty hard. But I do think there was this moment where things could have been radically different as well in the way that we interacted in those spaces. Again, I think non-Indigenous people often aren't aware of the level of generosity and kindness with which Indigenous people interact, and what we instill in those relationships, the awkward conversations we endure kindly, and the way we want to bring people on the journey. And that was a huge part of the referendum campaign, particularly, where you got asked a lot of stupid questions, and you got asked in your job, and you got asked in the street, and you got asked by your friends. And Aboriginal people were incredibly generous in that journey, incredibly positive. And so you come at the other end and you think, what is all of that for? And I think there was a bit of a throwing up of the arms and saying, well, I won't be doing that anymore. And we see that even in Arnie Robin talking about, there are some things that are just special for mob. And, I think there were a lot of people who also didn't want to do welcomes at all after, right? Because it says, well, what is this just a performance to you? Because this is an important part of our protocol about saying you're welcome here. But if we're not welcome in our own country, what does that really mean? And I think that, we have returned. We did go back to our jobs, maybe just because we had to pay the bills, but maybe because we wanted to believe in something and return to fighting for something. But I think there's been a subtle shift in maybe the priorities. And I think that came across, yes, in Arnie Robin saying, well, now there's special things for mob and then there's something for the rest. And I think even in terms of my own choices, which were all about timing and other things, I found myself now working in an Indigenous organisation from a non-Indigenous organisation. I've switched from a non-Indigenous board to my PBC board, really focusing, I think, back in on, okay, well, how are we delivering value directly to mob and to our community? So I think there hasn't been as radical a shift. I heard a rumour that reconciliation was dead. Sadly, that zombie continues to live on. Probably should have been dead about 20 years ago. But some of those old movements are changing, and I think that's sort of my kind of key takeaway from it was we had this initial defeat. We had a moment where I think like maybe we would have gone down a very different path where we sort of cut out of systems. We went with a really nation-building Indigenous sovereignty approach, but we sort of came back. But priorities might be, I think, a bit different. And it's not so much taking everyone on this journey all the time because the amount of labour that goes into that is huge. And I think we've seen that it doesn't always pay off.
Yeah, thank you. I fully agree with what you've said, and particularly the feeling of burnout post-referendum. We were so exhausted. It was just that combined with the result had a very strong effect on a lot of us. So my next question is for Tyson. For young people, this was the first referendum that we voted in. So what was the process like for you as a young Aboriginal person in the lead up and during and after, and particularly in the context of your work as a youth representative of the Uluru Statement?
Thanks, Sophie. And yeah, I say my experience was a bit unique because I was involved with the Uluru youth, and also at the time of being a participant of that movement. I think I just finished constitutional law with Murray Western, so I was quite a little expert amongst everyone about constitutional law. So anyone who was interested, I was like, yes, I could finally talk about it. Sadly, no more of those times. So the journey really began in 2019 when the invitation was out for young people from all over Australia to go. But Sophie and I were a part of it, and a few others. And so that's when it really began. In the first year or so, it was really about just being knowing what the Uluru Statement of the Heart when it first came out in 2017. It really wasn't much heard about, bits and pieces in the media. So for ourselves, we really had to be across the detail. And then COVID happened, and it was still happening in the background, and then it really ramped up when 2022, when the election was announced, and then it finally happened. And I remember we were on the bus back from Yellowbar, and it was announced once we got the phone service, and I do remember it. It was like the first time I was like, oh, this is real, like we're finally going to have this opportunity. And then you could say that's when the real work sort of began. And so that optimism really carried me through, and I think the adrenaline and the energy kind of kept me through. And it wasn't until maybe 6 months out from the referendum that it really started to get really negative. I feel like once Albanese made his commitment to which spectrum he was on, I think that's when it just changed. And at points I was trying to couldn't really look at the news or try to, usually get across the news, but headlines and sound bites were very nasty. Seeing, community members who don't really have the public microphone, who can't call a press conference, being attacked by some bureaucrat on the other side of the big country, was a bit hard to see, and I think a bit hurtful to have someone visit the state or the local town and then fly back over and say something totally mistrue. And that was during, and as I said, we were in Sydney when it happened, and I think that was the worst sort of part of it. I kind of didn't want to go into detail about what happened or how it messed up. Like, we ended up, I think I invested so much time into it. I was so optimistic that it was going to be a yes. And so I think in myself, internally, I had to reflect about, what happened. And I think moving forward, I'm still trying to deal with it. And I think moving forward is knowing that we tried everything to do it. But I think what kind of keeps me bringing back and being involved is that, all those corporations and organisations, they came out and made their position. Now's not a time for them to put, all right, let's put the queue in the rack. We've had our go. It's not really a priority anymore. So I think as a young person, and I try and engage everyone around to challenge those organisations for the future, because this isn't over.
Thank you, Tyson. And I agree that those organisations, there were so many across all different professions and fields, came out in support of the statement and made a public statement or signed something to do with the statement. And now there's just silence. And this is the time when they actually need to step up. So I agree with you on that. Thank you. The next question is for Hannah. What are the opportunities for the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights implementation in a post-referendum Australia without the voice?
Well, as Ken said correctly, Minister Malarndirri McCarthy is not going to proceed with the Makarrata Commission, and it's very clear that this is an election issue, so Indigenous rights are very silent now. We had the Senate inquiry into realising the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples last year, and a clear recommendation for a national action plan to progress that work, and that recommendation was also a recommendation of the UN World Conference on Indigenous Peoples over 10 years ago, and it was barely discussed in Australia all this time. And we, it's obviously set us back quite a bit, this situation. It doesn't mean that the right to self-determination is stopped altogether, of course. I mean, Aboriginal medical services, for example, are governed by Aboriginal boards and deliver, great Aboriginal health services. And Megan Davis, Professor Davis from the Uluru Dialogue, wrote an excellent article about that years ago as a model of internal self-determination in the delivery of Aboriginal healthcare. University of New South Wales are proceeding to develop a micro-treaty, so they're working closely with Aboriginal communities to ensure governance in that university. I mean, there are these actions that we can take. We've had reconciliation plans for many years, but sometimes they're a bit limited to NAIDOC week and cups of teas and whatnot, and not making these structural changes that we need. I had a conversation with Our Watch today, and they're making changes to ensure that Aboriginal people are also in the leadership of the organisation. So there's all these, commitments that we can still make. As you said, there were many organisations that supported the Uluru Statement, and while we're not going to see any movement politically until perhaps the next government, we really do need to take this initiative ourselves, as we really do need our non-Indigenous allies actually not to revert, because the Declaration's rights and standards were promised 17 years ago. And what we see too often is we're falling so short. These rights are not coming into play sufficiently, particularly the right to self-determination. In Canada, where I was fortunate also to visit, British Columbia has implemented legislation requiring the state to report annually on how they're implementing the Declaration rights, and it's also federal legislation. So the Declaration has a really much higher standing, and although there's a bit of cynicism from some Indigenous peoples that they're not seeing enough change, because of course they still have many struggles, as we do, around racism, discrimination and land. It certainly has given a lot more recognition to the Declaration, which is, really the only international document that is focused solely on the rights of Indigenous peoples. It was negotiated for 10 years, and these are really critical rights. I think I'll probably leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's also important how you've noted the timelines, how long these issues have been around, and how long ago Australia committed to implementing these rights, and yet nothing really seems to have been done. My next question is for Ken. Earlier this year at Gama, the Prime Minister walked back the government's commitment to treaty and truth-telling. As the leader of the co-design process, do you think we can have treaty or truth-telling processes despite this lack of commitment and without an enshrined voice?
Let's not underestimate the voices of Indigenous Australians, because they're going to continue. But we'll be doing it in very different ways. We'll be reclaiming the lost ground. And I was in a meeting today where we were talking about the actions that we will start to take to reclaim the leadership roles that have gone silent for a while. Because we have to do that if we want our grandchildren to have a better future than what we've experienced. And we don't want them being heartbroken, because when you look at the history of this nation, everybody has made some policy commitment within all tiers of government and never realised them. They've not come to fruition. United Nations declarations, we've always dragged our feet on a number of those. We've not signed them. And then when we have, they really don't have weight of power in our judicial system, because they have to be enshrined in domestic law. And that was created through Tay versus the Commonwealth in respect to the rights on the child, Convention on the Rights of the Child, in which the Supreme or High Court ruled in Tay's favour. The government of the day reacted by bringing in an amendment that required conventions to be enshrined in domestic law. So Australia can ignore them. The other, in terms of truth-telling, we can do that. We can do that through the arts, through theatre, through film, and through documentaries. We can start to pick out the history of this nation and show what's occurred, how it's impacted, because every time I hear the notion that it should be taught in schools, I watch governments change. I'm old enough to have seen a number of governments from Robert Menzies right through, come through and change curriculum in order for the black arm, as described by one Prime Minister, the black armband brigade should not dictate what is taught within schools, which was about our history. So the arts will be the way that we can pull that together. We have national archives. There are records that are kept in there that we need to start thinking about. Universities can play a significant role in this as well. In terms of a Makarrata Commission, I don't think we'll go anywhere near that. I think all governments will stay away from it. When I sit opposite a minister who says to me in a meeting, we're not going to do anything, because you have to remember, Ken, that 60% of Australians did not want the voice. And so it's a clear message to us that Aboriginal affairs is not a priority in the community of this nation. And that is a telling comment. But on the flip side, we've got to remember that 40% that backed us, that's 6 million Australians who've walked with us. And so we take those relationships and we build them. And we start addressing the true history of this nation, because it has to be told. And when you, and I got hold of my mother's native welfare files and my grandfather's, etc. I sat one day and read those and thought, how could we as a nation have allowed that to happen to individuals, where when the money they earned wasn't theirs, it was taken by native welfare. When they wanted a pair of underpants, they had to write a letter asking for a pair, or shoes. That's not all that long ago. And so this historical element that has prevailed has been unravelled by the work that we've all been doing collectively as a nation. But the referendum result tore the heart out of a lot of people. I sit on the board of Beyond Blue, and we've had 2 discussions about surveys and work that's been done that shows rejection is extremely high in the Indigenous community. And we're looking at the way we can deal with that. But while we've got the toing and froing between my old party and the Labor Party on Aboriginal affairs, we will not see truth-telling or a Makarrata Commission go forward. But thankfully, we've got Victoria, who are working on treaty and have honoured their commitment, even with the result. This state was never considering that at all. Territory has pulled back with the change of government. South Australia pulled back. So we've seen changes that are not consistent to a commitment. And that's why I feel for all of those people who are involved in the first working group that Julia Gillard established with Mark Lieber and Patrick Dodson, through to the 4 iterations of government that all made commitments. I sat in the room with Malcolm Turnbull, Bill Shorten, when Noel Pearson and the group that came from the Uluru Statement and presented their report, and watching them being rejected and being told this is not what government wanted. So we have to think as leaders now, and for all of us, to say, okay, how do we undo that and not be beholden to governments who won't move forward on the reality of humanity and who won't recognise that self-determination is given in various forms in this nation to local government. Local governments have incredible power and they have a say. The Federation of Ethnic Communities have state and federal structures that give advice to federal governments. And yet when we asked, the answer was no. That's why it hurts. That's why the rejection factor is quite strong, because we know of the empowerment that's given to others but not to us. I'm not bitter. I'm optimistic. And as my colleagues have said, this is the beginning of another journey in a very different way. And Robin made that comment. There are things that will be done, but they'll be done in a way in which we will cast our minds to our grandchildren so that they have a future that's planted in the bedrock, not of our constitution, but in the bedrock of our society, where we do play the roles that we have as leaders, but where the future is far more realistic and pragmatic than platitudes. We have to get over platitudinal commitments that come through various forms. And I know I was in government, but even when you're on the inside, you have to play within a team. Linda found the same. And when you're in that team, you are beholden to whatever is determined by your party. So we have to look at other avenues in which to break that nexus and move forward.
Thanks, Ken. And I really appreciate your optimistic, forward-looking attitude as well, especially as young people who were strongly affected by that outcome when we look to your generation for leadership. So I appreciate that. My next question is for Tyson. This referendum was unlike any other in terms of the presence of social media. Can you speak to the impact of social media in the lead up and how you think it might have affected the outcome?
Yeah, I think in this day and age, they were saying that the referendum was going to be the most documented referendum because the access of a mobile phone, a video, everything just being at a touch of a button, and how many platforms are out there. Even, I'm 28 and I had to cut down on how many bloody platforms are on because there's so many of them. TikTok, that's enough for me. Can't do it. And so the good and the bad of social media, being able to access certain information, be exposed to it, being able to listen to new sources, having a platform for local communities to have that you wouldn't otherwise see. And then on the flip side of that is when there was falsehoods or mistruths about how that information is just lurking within the sphere. Whatever the things we were taught about is that if it's out there and you share it, you actually bring the video or the source of it into your network, and then it just spreads. So that misinformation. And I think that whole discussion about how we use social media was kind of like rolled out in the referendum, and who do we believe, which source. One of the thing is it provides a voice for anyone with an idea or an argument just to put it up there. If it's even if it's not true or anything. And so I think having that community challenge about how we actually engage in those platforms, and also with the creators of these content, how can they be responsible with these arguments and sensitive ideas, because the last thing you want is to have them propel the anger or the anxiety in the community by taking a position or sharing falsehoods. So in this lead up, I think from my network, I thought it was quite productive in terms of argument face and everyone really engaging. But the real challenge of it is that once it's out there. You're not going to get it back. And so I would include social media into the news cycle as well. And I think my most when I was most concerned was about how using the web page and how these articles were coming up. And I won't say the news outlet, but in a day they were producing 28 articles, and you're starting to think, with the same photo to that headline, is it an AI generated article? And you start to be really concerned about where these sources are. And I don't want to go down too far right now, but I think the impact on the referendum is about, if it takes someone just to view one video or to hear their amazing creator on the idea about this is why you should vote yes or no, I think that's how it impacted. And they made their informed decision, and I think that's what I try to encourage everyone in my network and who I met at community events is, as long as you make a informed decision, it's totally up to you. You're exercising your democratic right now. And so I think going forward is, as a nation, we are having those discussions about the use of social media for teens and for youth, and the exposure to our mental health. So I think this won't be the last conversation we'll have about it.
Yeah, thank you. And I think as well, for young people, critically analysing the source of information is a skill that was really crucial in the referendum, because a lot of people would come to me and say, well, I heard this thing on TikTok, so I have to vote no. And I'd say, who said that, or how would they know? And, to really think about the actual sources. So it's interesting how that's impacted this referendum. My last question to Aurora: how does this outcome affect advocacy in terms of the wider narrative in Indigenous political advocacy?
Yeah. So I think the voice was always one tool in the arsenal, right? Like Indigenous people, we are the longest continuous culture in the world, and also with the longest continuous goals, which is just self-determination and caring for country. And we'll do whatever it takes to get those things. So our goals are always the same, and we take different techniques to get there. So I think the voice is really about how we build power structures, how we infiltrate positions of power. So, entering parliament, and, a whole range of other things, which might be very strong activism, might be going to the UN and some of that international activism and international legal work. We have partnership approaches. We have a whole range of different things that we constantly trying to make something stick in Indigenous affairs to get those goals. So I think with the sort of voice falling, it's just showing that the particular approach, which is, again, that one about bringing people on the journey and needing to get support for what we want to do, that sort of dropped down, I think, again. And there's a much sort of lower appetite for trying to have these big public campaigns that bring everyone together. I think, so my view before the referendum was the voice was something good that I wanted, but it wasn't something that was inspiring me in that same way that anything else was, because I'd been working in the Closing the Gap partnership, and I thought there were some pretty important structural changes that were happening through that partnership, just very quietly. So I do think that there's still a benefit to doing this kind of we can still critique the extent to which there's actually seen any change. But we can think about partnership models that have less fanfare, which is just saying get Indigenous people in the room with government, who we know government has power to make things, although, even within government, people are hamstrung by things like party politics and other things as well. But, we are Indigenous people on the outside. How do we get in the tent, and how do we do things? And you have to give up particular rights then, right? So when we're in Closing the Gap mode at the Coalition of Peaks, you're not allowed to be outspoken because you're in the tent. You've made that choice. But we still want people to be on the outside, being outspoken and playing that activist role, because we all have the same goal, ultimately, and we are going about it in very different ways, but it's a system of approaches that work together to get to that end goal. So I think sort of what the change is really is we actually have all gone back to doing what we've always done, which is continue to fight, continue to work, continue to chip away. But we might have slightly different emphasis. So perhaps just the context that I'm in now that I'm at the Native Title Council, we do have partnerships with government, and we work quite productively through those partnerships to achieve reform and changes. We also have a strong focus on the traditional owner sector, who are our members, so building up the capability of representative institutions in communities, so prescribed body corporates, which are the organisations that come out of native title to represent a community, like the Balgujari Aboriginal Corporation. So thinking about how we invest in those sorts of things, and that kind of nation building sovereignty approach that's really back in the community as well, that says, just we'll try and get as many resources as we can, and then we know what we're going to do with it. We've got a bit of a goal and a bit of a plan. So I think kind of that's the key change in terms of that advocacy piece and the approach. It's not actually a huge difference. The voice came out as an attempt to bring everyone on the journey, and we brought a lot of people along, maybe have some new allies who are doing work, but at the end of the day that approach didn't work, and I think we might not try that one again for a while.
Yeah, I think that's one positive thing to come out of the referendum, is we know what doesn't work, so we can pivot and make new strategies. I've got one question for the panel as a whole before we go to a Q&A. What is the future of constitutional reform in Australia generally, and particularly in light of changes we're seeing in New Zealand with constitutional windback? So I might go to Hannah first.
Yeah, I accept that we're not going to have much movement, obviously, for the near future, or perhaps even the next 5 years, but this issue has been around since the Council of Aboriginal Reconciliation 10-year process, which ended with a strong recommendation to amend this outdated constitution, which really, is a great disrespect to Indigenous people and not a good reflection of our country today. And We know that many countries around the world have certainly risen to the challenge. We've got a more, I think, a more difficult constitution than some of the countries that I've seen who have recognised Indigenous rights. The Sami constitutional rights, which reflect Article 27 of the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights, they didn't require a vote of the people in the way that we did. They said we probably wouldn't have got it up. We wouldn't get it up now if we had that kind of system. But you know, I think it's not going to go away. We're going to keep pushing for these rights. We know that closing the gap is actually going backwards every year. The announcements are worse in three main areas. So, you know, if we're not serious about genuinely, you know, addressing and improving race relationships through human rights framework, we're failing. We're failing Australia as a whole. In terms of New Zealand, I mean, the Maori people that I know said to me there was a lot of Maori interest in the Greens Party, which defeated the Labor Party, which now allowed this government, and there's some hope that this government will be voted out. So, you know, I hope that's true. They're very strong Maori people in terms of their rights and activism.
Yeah, that's certainly something that we look to as aspirational. Aurora, any thoughts?
I think just on that point particularly, I mean, it is scary though, because we're all here sort of mourning the loss of an opportunity with the voice, and I think when you see what can be wound back, and even if you look at the US and the winding back of some of the civil rights there, you know, these are hard fought for over decades, centuries, and can be really turned around quite quickly. So I think although, you know, we can question how serious, I mean, there have been some pretty big changes already in New Zealand, but we might question the seriousness of these kind of calls. I don't know if everyone's aware, but essentially, you know, there's a couple of parliamentarians who are calling to sort of reinterpret how the treaty applies in New Zealand. And so and go to a referendum for that, right? So there's questions about, like, I think that's quite scary, right? That this treaty, which is the foundation of the Māori relationship with the Crown, and something that we all look to as a really important founding document, you know, that's under threat. And so to think that we might not only lose opportunities that we could have had, but lose some of the hard fought gains that we've already made in this country is scary. And I think that's sort of a reminder to continue to do the work that we're doing to ensure that those sorts of things don't happen as well.
Yeah. Tyson, or?
Yeah, I might just quickly add is that, you know, as a young person, I think that was my first one, so I feel like there might be one or two to come. I might forecast that the Republic referendum might come along, where we might be a republic and sever our ties from England. And I think about that and what that impact could have on us as Australians, and how we look towards internally into our own history, and about really focus on us as a nation. Yeah.
Thank you. Ken, any final thoughts?
I think the only thing I'll say is that we've always been conservative on constitutional change. Only 8 out of 40, I think it's 44 now, have been successful. So it'll always be challenging. And if they have a referendum that repeals the strength of the Treaty of Waitangi, then that's going to send a very clear message that even treaties aren't sacrosanct. So we'll just wait and see. But as I said to Paul earlier, the Australian Constitution is an act of the British Parliament. Governments have repealed legislation.
Thank you. Well, we'll turn now to our Q&A session with our enthusiastic mic runners. So if you have a question, can you please raise your hand? And can I please just remind everyone to not offer comments or opinions?
Yeah, and
That's
also,
question.
Sophie, if we can ask people to say who they are and if there are questions for the whole panel or a
Yeah, who you'd
specific
like
member of the
for.
panel.
Yeah, thank
So
you.
you get to choose and we get to run.
Perfect. Yes, just up the back, right there.
Thank you. Good to be here today. Good to see you, Ken, again. Prashant Singh. Look, my question relates to very early days of Voice. And I did support voice referendum. It's sad to see this didn't go through. The very premises of making major changes to the constitution relies on bipartisan support. So what went wrong and how we can get a consensus in terms of both parties supporting that? Because that to me was a bit of, in speak, was a very weak start to this campaign.
Go, Ken.
That's you.
That's for Ken.
The bipartisan support was always a problem with a change of government, because there was an agreed position that Prime Minister Morrison had to take forward a question. And then with the change of government, we just had this entrenched position come from the coalition of just saying no. And the moment that no, and I was in the room when Peter Dutton addressed us, and listening to him, it was a resounding message that there would be no support for a bipartisan approach. Only once in the history of the constitutional reforms was there ever a question won without the other party supporting it. But that party was silent on that issue. It was to do with social welfare, and that got through. The moment you say no from either party, then it just dies. So there was a whole lot of other things that went wrong as well, but it's how we reflect on what we do for the future.
Thank you.
Sophie, we have a question here. You can't see this
Oh, I
direction, but a
can't
gentleman
see,
here
sorry.
has his hand
Yes,
up. If that's okay,
please.
can I
That's okay.
abuse my position?
You can.
Okay, thank
Please
you.
do.
Thanks very much. Nathan Gibson. Reflection is always really critically important, but going forward, strategically, how much and how should we be reflecting on this voice referendum going forward from here?
Well, if you voted no, you should be reflecting very hard on yourselves.
Forever.
Do a lot of reflecting. Yeah, look, I think there's always that balance that we've talked about as the panel between looking at the past and looking at the future. But we've sort of already said the key lesson and the key takeaway is perhaps we're not at the position that we thought we were in and where we maybe could go and where we were looking to as a future. It doesn't mean we can't attack structural reform in other ways and we can't try and move resources and move power in other ways. So I think don't spend too long in the past, but the more we can think about what the lesson from this really is in order to move forward. And I think that's it. It's, you know, think about other ways to achieve this, and also be really aware that not everyone's at the level that we maybe thought they were on that awareness and understanding and recognition of Indigenous rights.
Yeah, and if I can just add a point to that as well. I've got one, thanks. It's also part of truth telling to be reflecting, I think. So important to acknowledge the truths of that referendum and all of the other history that a lot of people still unaware of or choose to ignore. Thank you. Any other questions? Oh my goodness. We'll just go here for now and then we'll move across.
Here?
Sorry, Dave. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Just wanting, reflecting again on the referendum, one of the things that we found was that there were a lot of organisations that did get very mobilised to support the no campaign and resist the voice. Groups like the Advance Australia, Institute of Public Affairs obviously got a whole bunch of Gina Rinehart's money. And there are even nastier sort of far-right groups out there, and they managed to get mobilised pretty quickly because they had a fairly simple message: vote no, effectively. So if referendums are now off the table, so to speak, or at least they're not really seen as the particular path forward, what lessons does the panel reckon we could learn from the resistance? You know, how to fight that resistance or how to anticipate it going forward with other changes.
I think one of the ones was I don't want to keep harping on about it, but the truth telling and what's happening with those truth commissions. I think a part of the vote no is that the tactic of causing the fear in someone that they're gonna lose something, and of course the natural reaction is I'm gonna remove that risk and do it. You know, there was conversations about how the Voice was gonna take someone's house and people were gonna lose their farmland if it went up. So that's why someone was saying they voted no. And I think about that argument, and it's always they're gonna take your house. You know, when has Aboriginal rights trumped a landowner's house or parts of land? Like, it hasn't happened. I don't think.
It was the same with native title.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the native title. So I'm trying to come to is how do we turn the page about this boogeyman that we're gonna take your land away. It's this constant argument that I don't know where it's coming from, but it keeps arising. So looking forward, that's why I rely on the truth telling about, are we gonna have this discussion about what fears people, what fears the community? There's a lot of things, but I feel like after the referendum, I think we're ready to have those hard conversations.
Yeah.
I'll just add quickly, the research from UTS in Sydney indicated that a lot of the no vote was being funded by, I think it was Atlas Network, connected to the fossil fuel industry. So, why? Because you don't want Aboriginal people to have a strong say, particularly over land.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think adding to that as well, it's the biggest lesson for me is that it's really hard to work with a deficit where you're challenging someone's worldview to try to educate them into voting yes, where, as you said, it was very simple and easy to say, no, you're going to lose your rights, just vote no. It was, we were, yeah, or if you don't know, which is just terrible. So I think that we had a much harder job in trying to convince people and change the way they think for what they've been taught their whole lives about Aboriginal people. And it was so much easier for people to just say, just vote no. Yeah. So thanks for your question. Yes, in the middle here.
Hi, so I work in the community service sector, and I happen to be working at a Aboriginal controlled organisation at the time of just prior to the Voice, the referendum. What I was most confronted by was grassroots Aboriginal community saying they were going to vote no, that there's nothing that was going to change for them, so why vote yes? And I was like, I think, shocked, because how do I convince your people, basically? And I mean, Hannah knows me from when I was a uni student. I've been in the sector for like 25 years, and I never thought I would be challenged by, like the people that we were advocating for. So I don't know, like,
well, my response to that is Aboriginal people can vote however they want, and it's not your role to ever tell. The whole point of the Voice is to let Aboriginal people speak for themselves. So if Aboriginal people did not think, and many Aboriginal people did not think the Voice was for them, and that's an okay position. I think this is the other thing we have to remember, to embrace the diversity of Aboriginal people. And when you speak about, what you're doing for Aboriginal people, again, that's the sort of language and rhetoric that comes from a really positive place, but can help perpetuate this thing that, you do things for Aboriginal people rather than Aboriginal people doing themselves. And if Aboriginal people wanted to say no at the referendum, power to them.
I'm going to add something.
Yeah. Is that Andrew?
Yes.
Hey, how you going? Look, I think it's there was a lot of after COVID and that, there was a lot of conspiracy theory going around, and our people were also affected by that. And I just want to say too that Aboriginal people were prohibited in education like way into, Ken will know exact the decade, but my mother was one of the first to get 59. My mum was one of the first to come up to Perth from Noangarup and get an education. And so, you know, and there's also the issue of distrust because of this strong history of legalised racism and discrimination that many people just felt this can't be for us, or that they did have feelings about, you know, that it would be elites and this the benefits would not flow. So these were some of the I thought were the explainers.
Thank you. Up there. Yep. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you. Thank you. Scott Wilson here. Thanks for sharing and thanks for all your deadliness and all the work that you're currently doing and have done. One of the questions I wanted to share is, let's just say for the sake of optimism, Ken, and going back to that first question you answered with a no, let's just say secretly somewhere sitting in this room is a billionaire. No, let's say trillionaire. And we said, we're going to take this resource, a bottomless pit, give it to you. Where are you going to start? Where could we start? You can do anything, everything. We're going straight to constitutional reform, change. What are we going to do?
Ooh, that's fun. Back in power.
Look, your question is a very interesting one because it challenges our stereotypified views of the Aboriginal society, because over the last probably decade, we've seen our people move to positions of economic wealth creation. The number of Aboriginal businesses, they're employing people. And it's both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal they're employing. And what we're seeing is they're becoming leaders within the economic structures of this country. And they're going to have an impact. That's where I want to see us now go to, so that we become self-sufficient. And then eventually we can say to governments, we don't need your money, because we are operating under our own terms and conditions. But there's still a lot of work to be done in areas of education, training, employment, poor health, the high incarceration rates. And I'd love to see our organisations, including the Aboriginal Legal Service, turn around and say, next year, we're going to reduce incarceration rates by 10% and change the focus of that work. So we've got to take the constructive positive and make the changes ourselves without relying on governments and ministers making those decisions, because I think that's where the power is. And $1 trillion would help take us there.
Following on, sorry, just from that question, Ken, do you think that big corporations like oil and gas mining have a responsibility to help in this space because they have the capital and the resources?
Well, they have been, because when government started the procurement processes, the large corporations started to hire Aboriginal companies, even small ones, and help invest. Daniel Tucker was telling me when he first started Kerry Mining, he couldn't get capital. And it was a mining company who loaned him equipment and gave him financial support so he could start Kerry Mining. He now has a staff in excess of 400 and he's doing exceptionally well. So yes, they can in that regard. But if they continue providing contracts that are competitive and that allows us to grow our wealth, then that's a beginning. But I also want to see them employ people. I'd also like to see investments. So if we've got a position like trust accounts, being able to take, say, 10 million out of that and buy $10 million worth of the company, so that you have a 40-year period of income that's not royalties, that is an income. So that's some of the forward thinking we have to do.
Thank you.
My just one response to that is that I think these companies do have an obligation or can make a huge difference, but we also have to think about what the core business of a lot of these companies is and see it in a holistic way, where if the basis of your business is to sort of extinguish native title and Indigenous rights to land through mining and other things as well, that you have to factor that into the price that you're paying. So making sure that actually try not to infringe on Indigenous people's rights to begin with, and then make sure that there's actually fair price, not this sort of pennies and royalties in what we do, and then we can think about the other kind of contribution back. But sometimes the core business is actually at odds with the economic goals of Indigenous people anyway, and it's sort of counterproductive to what you want to do.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, in the middle here.
Thank you. My name's Elizabeth Lang. I've got a question, and I think it's directed at Hannah. You made a comment, and you touched on the issue of racism, and you acknowledged that while it was not, I guess, the only reason, it was a huge part of the driving factor in terms of the result. What opportunities do you see there are to, I guess, shift the conversation on the issue of racism, given that it's a very contentious issue in Australia? There's a lot of resistance to even saying the word racism, I find. What opportunities are there to explore the issue of racism in Australia as it pertains to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples?
Thanks. Well, the Human Rights Commission is conducting the first national, action plan on racism ever. So there's a little opportunity there. There's been some more financial resources from the government for that to happen because they were stripped of their funding. They're not very well resourced. But that's kind of small, isn't it, really? And in Victoria, the Uluru Truth-Telling Commission has been looking at systemic discrimination and racism in its contemporary forms. And, within that, though, you can see a backflip on, for example, raising the commitment of the government to raise the age of criminal responsibility. That can still happen. It's not as bad as the Territory that says they want to go down to 10 years now. And we're seeing, this all around the country, and we're seeing, children die here in men's maximum security prison as well. So there really does need to be quite a big movement of the people. And I think, the United States, we're seeing, all sectors, right and left and middle, but hopefully, Trump won't be elected, but they have had a lot more progressive initiatives, I think, in that in their communities and also in their universities with some really practical programs about addressing racism. But this is something for our leaders, and we're not seeing from our leaders of our universities, even in particular, that kind of commitment. It's incredibly disappointing and wrong.
We've got time for one more question. There's one lady behind you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Margareta Cheney. I actually would like to do something which is to it's easy to be overwhelmed at moments like this, to think the road ahead is really long and really hard, and I don't want to walk away like that. And I know that we're talking about in 20 to 30 years, maybe there's a conversation that will lead us down to the place that we should have been last year. I'd like to go back to a comment that Ken made, which is about one of the ways we can do truth-telling is through storytelling and the arts. And that immediately when you said that, I thought, Yuriakan, there's a storytelling space right now that has a season on. And of course, and I saw that the other night, and I encourage you all to go and see it. And so that when we don't have $1 trillion, and we are sitting here today, and we want to walk away knowing what small step that we can take here in Perth, in this environment, I'd love to hear from all of you maybe what your one takeaway for us to do, so we feel like we can actually take a step forward, a productive one. As I say, I'd encourage you all to go and engage in the arts that are out there, to go and find out where they are, to go and experience the stories that they are telling, to really seek them out, because the more we know and the more we become familiar, the more we start to spread the word step by step. But I'd love to hear from each one of you what that one simple, practical,
Yeah, we'll start with Tyson. Thank you.
Thanks for that. I think one thing, I know you said one thing, but I'll say two. The first one would be, you could go to those local events, those gigs, and really make the most of that local content out there. And two, there is a state election coming up, and a part of the Uluru youth was writing letters to your members, your local members, and I was quite surprised they do write back, a few of them, the good ones, and I was able to meet my member Kate Cheney, who I met with, and having that 20-minute conversation was really good. And so if you think, if she has 100 of those conversations by next election, she's definitely going to remember your message. So if anyone in the room has a spare 15 minutes, write to your member or attend a local event.
Thank you.
I don't know what to say, because we don't have those accessible reconciliation groups around anymore where we could talk about issues, and it's gotten a little bit too tame for my liking. I want to see substantive reforms, but I certainly won't be voting for any political party that's not going to make a strong commitment to Indigenous people, and we are very much behind Victoria and South Australia now that has a legislated voice. And treaty reforms. I know it's precarious across the country, but we've always been in this terrible situation with such a large surplus, and yet we're so denied our immediate needs and rights really to address dire serious issues in our communities.
Oh, I'm surprised. I might be maybe a little bit of a downer in sort of. I think I sort of just want to reflect briefly on truth-telling. So it's not going to be simple, sorry. But, we often think about truth-telling as Indigenous people telling stories, and I think I just want to be really clear that it's really about truth listening, because we've told our stories again and again and again and again. And, truth-telling, you've got to remember, is a process of showing up and learning and doing that active learning if you're non-Indigenous. So also that question of what's the one simple thing, can you tell us the one simple thing to do? The one simple thing to do is ask yourself that question. So what is the one simple thing I can do without putting that burden on Indigenous people? But you might have another thing to add.
The most simplest thing is a conversation, because often there are so many myths to do with Aboriginal affairs. And when you have a conversation with somebody, you start to tease out and challenge some of their thinking and say, why do you think that way? Why do you believe that? Because what I've found, that's not the case. I know Aboriginal people. I once smiled at a colleague of mine who in their first speech said, if you want to get to know Aboriginal people, invite them to dinner. And afterwards, I said to him, why did you say that? And he said, I had to say something, because everybody else had made reference to Indigenous Australians in a lot of their first speeches, which I'd not seen before. And I think that was an important message of saying, by having the conversations, you start to share knowledge. We do it in every other area. Football and sport, we're brilliant at sharing knowledge. We can share stats on players. We can share info on Olympians. But when it comes back to our First Nations people, we don't. And some of the best conversations are around a dinner table or around a barbecue. Forget about bars, because often in bars you get into heated debates and then there are other issues. But my simple message is conversations that are two-way.
Thanks, Ken. So we'll wrap it up now. Thank you for your questions, everyone, and thanks for your listening and attendance. So we've heard from a range of topics to do with the referendum tonight, the perspective of young people and what that was like having our first referendum and campaigning for that. And we've heard about the international perspective on the referendum and Australia's disgrace, but the lack of caring by this country, I suppose, in terms of commitment to those rights. And we've heard about quiet negotiations, if I could frame it that way, Aurora, as you have, and how our advocacy will change. Not big, loud advocacy. It's going to be a combination of being inside and outside the tent, as you said. And so that's really useful to think about. And we've heard from Ken about reclaiming lost ground and putting our people back in those leadership roles and in roles where we can affect real change and not having to rely on other people making promises that they don't follow through with. So I hope that you've all taken something valuable from this conversation and have some appreciation of the difficulty that that experience was for us, and also the hope that we have for the future and how 6 million people voted for us, and we hope that some of those or all of you are part of that number in the room and on this positive journey with us into the future. So thank you.
Thanks, Sophie, and thanks everyone on the panel. And you know, this is a difficult topic, difficult questions that confront, you know, 1 year on from the referendum last year. And it's kind of put me in mind of where I'm from in Northern Ireland in terms of we're 20 odd years into a peace process, and the question of kind of a United Ireland's on the horizon. It's something that I thought would never ever happen in my lifetime. And I was always quite pessimistic about it, but I'm more optimistic about it now. And you know, the whole variety of factors I never thought would materialize have materialized in more recent times. And I think picking up on the optimistic comments that were in everybody's comments, we should kind of build on those, and you know, that's where we've got to use those as springboards to elevate forward as we look forward and things. And I think there is opportunity there. I did have a question, and maybe this is just a comment to think about generally rather than the panel asking, but is, you know, you mentioned about it being in the tent, you know, through the Constitution and the Voice and the referendum. You know, and Ken knows this because we've had a discussion about this, is, you know, is the future about having an Indigenous political party a way of affecting change going forward? Basically, both a federal Indigenous party and state Indigenous party. So you come in the tent through a different door and affect change by operating within the tent, rather than letting the Parliament enlarge and affecting change. Because in the last decade here, we've seen the rise of independents and titles, and it only takes one in a Parliament to be able to, you know, to turn things over because of cross-party, you know, the balance of power where it lies in upper and lower house, particularly in the upper house. So it can only take an N of one to change things potentially. So that's something I've been kind of thinking about and discussing with Ken. But so that's maybe something for us to think, and maybe there's a trillionaire here who can fund that party in some way, you know, in order to make this happen, or even a millionaire or a thousandaire. Well, we'll start off with a thousandaire, and we can see what we can do. So, look, a lot of passion and deep thought and thinking in tonight. So again, thank you everybody for your comments and insights and taking the time to share all of those with us. Just thinking forward about other things that are coming up here with the PPI. We have when is it, on the 28th of October, we're partnering with the colleagues in the School of Psychology for the Robin Winkler Lecture on a topic looking at mental health is political, global Indigenous struggles for racial justice and collective healing. And that's on the 20th of October here on UWA at the Social Sciences Lecture Theatre. We're also having, at the end of the month, we have one of our kind of Breakfast by the Bay events, now for the long-term future generations, and looking at children and young people and the future around there. And there's a bit of kind of an Indigenous component looking within there. And then also the PPI runs the Pathways to Politics for Women program. So if there are any women, non-binary or trans folk in the room, and if you're interested in getting involved in politics, keep an eye out for our call for participants for our Pathway to Politics for Women program, which we'll have be running next year. We had our inaugural program this year, and we had 20 women from across WA take part in that program. We were lucky Ken and a whole bunch of others were involved in it. And it was an amazing opportunity and space to try to, you know, bring more women into the political sphere so we can do politics differently and we can do politics better moving forward, basically, as well. Just a couple of thanks, my colleagues, Murray Wesson and Sarah Murray from the law school, for their, you know, giving us the opportunity to part with them. They're the brainchilds behind all of this, basically, as the constitutional lawyers in the room. So thank you very much, Murray and Sarah. It's great partnering with you again. And I think basically that's it. And big thank you to all of you, basically. Oh, yes, sorry, okay. So got to invite Murray and Sarah up. We have a small token of appreciation for your involvement and contributions tonight. So.
It's much more low key, Aurora.
A quick word, Murray. One of you should say a quick word.
Well, I think Sarah and I agreed today we didn't actually have anything to say at the end of this event, but it's been a fantastic panel, so thank you to Sarah for working with me on this. Thanks to PPR. Most importantly, thanks to the panelists.